This is the Law, Finance and Economic Policy Talk Show, and we're simplifying economic facts for the everyday man. Today we'll be talking about a popular term that's conversant in economic conversations, which is GDP, i.e. Gross Domestic Product. Now, what is GDP? Gross Domestic Product essentially measures the total value of goods and services produced in an economy in a given period, let's say a given year. It shows the overall health of an economy, and an increasing GDP rate shows that the economy is growing positively. Increasing real GDP rates, actually. So when I say real GDP rates, the question then is there fake GDP rates? No, there's no fake GDP rates, but there's nominal GDP rates. So nominal GDP essentially is the total value of goods and services in an economy in a given period, like I said. But what real GDP does is that it looks at inflation as a factor, and it makes sure that inflation doesn't distort the figures. So it discounts inflation from the equation in looking at GDP. What is inflation? We know that inflation measures the increase or sometimes a decrease in goods that the average consumer would purchase. For example, what are the changes in price of a basket of tomatoes? That is what we use to determine inflation in an economy. So real GDP ensures that isn't taken into consideration. So now we know what GDP is, we know what nominal GDP is, we know what real GDP is, and we've also touched on what inflation is. I would like us to discuss what ideal or potential GDP should be. The ideal or potential GDP growth rate is a rate at which the economy can sustain its growth without going into inflation. So it ensures that the economy is not growing too fast and is also not growing too slow, so that it's at a stable level that it can attain or it can sustain without running into troubles like inflation, unemployment. We'll come into that a bit small. Now, so when you now look at what the ideal GDP rates should be and what the actual rates should be, we call that difference an output gap. So an output gap can be positive, that is the economy is growing faster than its ideal rates. That positive gap is also known as an inflationary gap. We'll touch on that in a bit. Or it can be negative, that is the economy is growing slower than its ideal rates. And when it's negative, we call that a recessionary gap. Not necessarily that the economy is in recession, but that difference is called the recessionary gap. Or it can just be zero, equal, meaning that the economy is growing at the right rates, the perfect rates. So now let's look at the positive / inflationary gap and then the negative / recessionary gap. So why do we say that it's an inflationary gap when the economy is growing faster than its ideal or potential rate? Now, we say this because when the economy is growing faster, this means that there's increased economic activity. There's more demand for labor, and that means that unemployment goes down. But then the challenge with increased economic activity is that the prices of goods and services go up. And like we discussed with inflation, when the prices of goods and services go up, inflation goes up. So let me take that again. When an economy is growing faster than it should, it's called a positive or inflationary gap. But what happens is that inflation goes up, but then employment comes down because there's increased economic activity. Now, for the recessionary or negative gap, when the economy is growing slower than it should, what happens is that because there's reduced economic activity, there's reduced demand for employment, so employment rate goes high. There are no jobs essentially, but there's also reduced economic activity, like I said, and inflation goes low. So when the economy is not growing as fast as it should, it's negative, and inflation comes down, but unemployment goes up. So this relationship between inflation, unemployment, and also the GDP rates is usually measured through something known as the Phillips curve. Not so necessary for you to know per se in your everyday conversations. But then the next question you ask me is, well, Chinaya, do we see this? Is this what happens in reality, or is this just is this just for conversation basis? Does this happen in reality? Well, these factors, they just give us a snapshot on how to assess an economy's health. But it doesn't mean that it would apply all the time. It can differ based off different factors. So I'll give an example. In Nigeria, we usually experience what we would call stagflation. And what this means is that inflation is increasing And ideally, when inflation is increasing, unemployment should come down. But what happens is that inflation is increasing, unemployment is increasing, while the GDP growth rate is reducing. So based off what I'd explained, this is an anomaly, but sometimes that is what occurs. And what could cause stagflation, you may ask? It could be different things. It could be poor monetary policies. It could be sharp increase in things like oil prices and a few other factors. But just generally, all these terms would help us to be more confident when we're trying to understand what's going on in our economy, or understanding what sort of policies we should be advocating for the government to put in place, based off whether we're at a stagflation period, we have a recessionary gap, or an inflationary gap. So let me know if this was helpful, if you now understand what GDP is, what nominal GDP is, what real GDP is, what ideal or potential GDP is, output gaps, inflationary gap, recessionary gap, and stagflation. So those are the terms that we've been able to cover in this video. Do let me know if it was helpful, and stay tuned for the next video. Bye.